Hello, and welcome to part 3 of our webinar on the resegregation of schools. First, I'd like to thank my colleagues for their insight into the history of segregation in our country. Now, for this next portion of the webinar, we're going to dive into some of the guiding questions about what the root of this issue is and what can be done about it. With how long the problem has persisted in the country, you might be asking yourself, where do we even begin? Now, when analyzing this problem that seems to have no easy solution, it might be best to try a clinical approach to the problem. We need to treat the issue in the same manner that a physician treats an undiagnosed malady, by noting all of the factors or symptoms that we can observe and linking them to one or more root causes. So, on to our first question. What factors are important to consider in regards to recent trends towards resegregation? It has been easy for the media and the majority of the population to blame the schools for the trend in segregation. This is understandable, considering that just by looking at the state report cards for any school, it is very easy to observe how different schools have differing populations of various ethnic groups. As an example, here is a demographic graph showing the population of one of the schools where I taught. As you can see, the school had a population of primarily white students making up 52%. The Hispanic population was the second largest, with 39%, and the remaining ethnic groups make up the remainder, with 5% being multiracial, 2% being American Indian and Alaskan Native, and the Black, Asian, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations each making up 1%. The trend is similar in the entire school district across all grade levels. This story that pervades most of the conversation around this issue is not the whole story, however. In reality, research has shown that the issue of school segregation is not primarily a problem of the schools themselves, as much as it is an issue of the neighborhoods that surround the schools and how district lines are drawn. Richard Rothstein, who is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute, wrote in his report, For Public Schools, Segregation Then, Segregation Since, Education and the Unfinished March, that it is not reasonable, in fact it is indeed misleading, to study school segregation in New York City without simultaneously studying residential segregation. The two cannot be separated. His report goes on to detail some examples of the government's history of segregating neighborhoods through the use of deliberate public policy. He cites examples from New York City of how public policy was implemented by city, state, and federal governments with the aim of separating the races residentially. Those examples include the following. First, when the city and state created Stuyvesant Town in the 1940s, they cleared an integrated low-income neighborhood to build a segregated development for whites only. A second example was when the government financed suburbs like Levittown. It did so with a federal requirement that no homes be sold to African Americans, and whites left the city for these federally subsidized segregated suburbs. A third example was when the federal government and city collaborated to build public housing in the mid-20th century. They built separate projects for whites, including the Williamsburg houses, and for African Americans, such as the Harlem River houses. It was only after whites in public housing were given suburban housing options in federally segregated subdivisions that vacancies in public housing for whites were opened to African Americans. Now, these examples are just the ones that he cites from New York. There are far more examples of this attitude's influence on government policy decision-making than can be easily recounted in a single webinar. The area where we are currently studying has even shown this attitude in the enforcement of certain laws in the past. According to Walida Emerisha, an adjunct professor of history at Portland State University and Oregon State University, the state of Oregon has a similar history of prejudicial practices towards minorities. In fact, the Ku Klux Klan had a larger start here in the 1920s than any other area in the nation. Due to the exclusion and prejudice present in our area over the course of the 20th century, Oregon's black population is currently around 2%, with 80% of that population living primarily in the Portland metro area. The experts on this topic believe that the root of these issues lie in the history of housing. Bearing all of that information in mind regarding the history of prejudicial policies, the next question we should ask is, how has legislation related to economic policies and housing and lending policies affected the diversity of school populations? As we've seen from Rothstein and Emerisha's examples, communities had been segregated on the basis of race and socioeconomic status. I mentioned earlier that the problem with school segregation is less of a problem with the schools and more of a problem with how neighborhoods are divided and district lines are drawn. The The problem of segregation is one that has multiple causes that have been perpetrated by members of different industries. Earlier we saw examples of how the government has used public policy to forcefully segregate neighborhoods. Similarly, when the urban communities of the 20th century were first being formed, the lending industry had a common practice of rejecting people for loans based on their ethnicity. This practice, called redlining, was used with the intention of keeping the minority populations away from predominantly white neighborhoods. Several maps of these redlined areas of major cities are easily found online. As an example, have a look at this map of Portland, Oregon from 1934. The green areas were the most favorable, being the first grade, followed by the blue neighborhoods at the second grade. The yellow areas were the third grade, and the red, as you can imagine, is the fourth grade. In each of these areas, values are given utilizing a number of factors using an area description sheet. As an example, take a look at one of these first grade areas, A2. If we take a look at the description sheet, the appraiser wrote, under the heading of favorable influences, the phrase homogeneous population. Later in the form, we can see that there are special sections for the percentage of the population that is Negro, of which there are none in this particular area, as well as the infiltration of section that says few. For comparison's sake, let's take a look at the description of the sheet for D5, an area that was designated as fourth grade. Among the descriptors for detrimental influences are the phrases heterogeneous population and improvements, as well as subversive racial elements. Later in the same special sections we noted earlier, the Negro section shows the number 100, and the infiltration of section shows, open quote, subversive races occurring, close quote. A section that we didn't point out earlier is the foreign-born families section, which also shows that 25% of the population in this area of Portland were primarily foreign-born and were among the Italian, Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino population. There was another common practice in a tangentially related industry. Real estate agents used the practice of steering, which the National Association of Realtors describes as the practice of directing people to specific neighborhoods based on their race, color, religion, gender, disability, familial status, or national origin. The inverse of this idea was also a common practice. This was referred to as blockbusting, or the practice of convincing homeowners to sell their house at a substantial loss by scaring them with the idea of an influx of members of a minority population. These practices were deeply rooted in these industries, and the governmental agencies that oversaw them, namely the Federal Housing Authority, or FHA, made recommendations and crafted policies with the intent of preventing integration of neighborhoods. Between 1935 and 1950, when roughly 15 million homes had been built, the FHA wrote their underwriting manual for their appraisers, which stated that if a neighborhood is to retain its stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and ethnic group. They encouraged their appraisers to offer lower valuations of properties based on the ethnic background of the occupants, and went so far as to drive developers who insisted on open occupation policies out of business. It's clear that the roots of this problem run deep. Students and families today are still suffering from the effects of these harmful housing and lending practices. Thankfully, schools are making more efforts to combat this problem today than ever before. This naturally leads to our next question. What are schools doing today that has proven to be effective for fostering diverse populations? The most effective solutions to this problem that we have seen so far have been at the local level, where members of communities have banded together to promote diversity and create more equitable education opportunities for their children. During a January 7, 2016 PBS NewsHour segment titled How Do We Solve Stubborn Segregation in Schools, Pedro Noguera, a professor at UCLA, discussed a few examples of these kinds of communities. Now, I'll put a link for the full interview in the description down below for those of you who would like to watch it, but I'll quickly summarize his main points here. During the interview, he related the story of Booker T. Washington High School in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where 50% of the student population is black, and how the school is looked up to for its quality of education that it provides to the diverse student population. He attributes this school's success partly to a group of former students of the late John Hope Franklin, who was a professor at Duke University and an advocate for reparations for the black community. These students, who were mostly white upper middle class, came together to rebuild a black neighborhood, Greenwood, that had been burned down during the race riots of 1924. Noguera points to this as an example of how communities can come together to improve everyone's lives through concentrated efforts. Noguera also gives two other solutions to the problem at the local level. The first is to ensure that schools are able to help students with their basic needs as outlined by Maslow's hierarchy, starting with ensuring that students are fed and expanding into meeting the psychological and health-related needs of these students by employing more counselors, more nurses, more social workers, and more SPED faculty to ensure that students who might need an IEP or 504 receive those services. The second is to have the school as a whole promote literacy. Every teacher in every subject should have literacy be a focus of the class, whether it's science, math, art, or even music. The idea behind this approach is to ensure that students have the tools that they need in order to more easily understand the world around them. To quote Noguera, having strong literacy skills in reading, writing, and speaking is the key to a strong education. So all is not lost. In fact, we are far from that point. I understand. It's easy to feel discouraged with the current state of education in the country, but it is important to remember that for every politician or pundit that will attempt to discredit public education, there are 1,000 of us who work in the field every day to ensure that the lives of our students are at least a little better. And the best news is that we outnumber them. And if we come together to effect change on a local level, we can show those who craft the policies the evidence of our hard work and effect real change on the national level. Now, I hope you're all as excited as I am to tackle our final question. How can I be a part of the effort to desegregate our schools and communities? At this time, I'm going to turn the discussion over to my colleagues as they discuss what we can start doing to be a part of the solution. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoy the next segment of our presentation. Take care.